much for coming today. We have an amazing group of panelists today, so I'm going to just chime in briefly. I want to know how you're doing well, and that's why we have a poll there up there. So in a few seconds, we will put up the poll when it's done. We've got many of you on already, so that's fantastic. There is a wait list, so in about 4 more minutes, we're going to allow the people to go onto the wait list so they can go ahead. I want to thank you again, because it's so important to have webinars of this type, the CBC industry breakfast webinars. We find that this helps really shorten the gap of social distancing. The information that you'll be getting from professionals as we have today will actually make a huge difference in your lives. So it has in mind, because the information that we have been able to get from these lovely people, even in the past, has made a lot of the businesses and also our personal lives much easier. So what we're going to do is, can you just show us the quick poll? That's enough just to give us a rough idea, because we have most of the people are on. So poll results, just as you, and the best part of it all is I'm sure they're out of self-isolation, maybe they're back to work. And thank you, they're telling us that webinars like this are very important, with 59%. And how many of you are either Canadians and locals and other? And that would be a true Canadian. A true Canadian is very much an other. So, and yes, of course, we'll be more than happy to give you our information of our whole program. So I just want you to know that we're here for you. We've got your back. So we're going to go today. I'd like to take, let's just kick it off here with a few words as an introduction. We've got Charles. Charles, can you just say hello so everyone can see you?
Hello, Charles Laubach here.
Yes, great. Yes, there you are. Thank you. Right. Charles and Shahram. Shahram, can you also say hello quickly?
Hi, everyone. Good to talk to you. Good to see you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, they are partners, Afridi Angell. Charles has been practicing as a legal consultant in the UAE since 1986. So I'm sure he's got a lot of expertise and has seen the ups and downs of life here. He heads the firm's employment practice. He also advises on general corporate matters, international trade controls and sanctions, and project finance. Sorry about that. Phil is trying to get me. He's trying to get online, our chairman. So Shahram has been practicing as a legal consultant in the AUE since 2002. He heads the firm's real estate practice. Shahram also represents clients on general corporate matters, private equity, and venture capital. So Charles, I think this is the moment that you should answer and go ahead with it, and then I can find out what Phil wants from me. Okay, thank you.
Certainly, thanks, Diana, and thank you to the CBC for organizing this, and thank everyone out there who's participating in this webinar for joining us. Shahram and I are going to talk about the COVID-19 crisis and the effect it's having in general, also the effect it's having on the employment market here in the UAE and also in the real estate market. Our firm, Afridi Angell, is the longest established foreign independent firm in the UAE. We've been here since 1975. And what that means is that we were here during the Iranian Revolution. And we were here during Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. We were here during 9/11 and the American occupation of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. We were here during the banking crisis of 2008. But what we're seeing right now is something that is having a more disruptive effect on the economy and on our way of life than any of those. So it's really an unprecedented set of circumstances we're facing. And it's new for our firm. It's new for all of you as well. And Shahram and I are going to share some of our insights and opinions on this. As you can probably tell by our CVs, Shahram and I together have something like 55 years of experience practicing law in this country. So I hope we can deliver some of our perspective to you in today's presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Shahram to talk about some facts and figures of the impact of COVID-19 on our economy. Shahram?
Thank you very much, Charles. It's our pleasure to be here to talk to you this morning. We're going to start off by talking about the economy and the market, the general overview, what really everyone is concerned about. The COVID-19 pandemic has swept the globe like a tsunami. It continues to wreak havoc on countries, their people, and the services and infrastructure that has been available to them. The UAE, unfortunately, is no exception. Indeed, the effects of the pandemic are being seen now as an indicator. And if you look at the US unemployment rate, it's now at 14.7%. In the peak of the 2008 financial crisis, the unemployment rate was 10%. The rate is predicted to rise to 25%, it's Goldman Sachs, equivalent to that of the US Depression in the early 1930s. So the impact so far has been staggering. The UAE Minister of Cabinet Affairs and the Future, Mr. Mohammed bin Abdullah Al-Gargawi, says, history confirms that global changes often occur after major events. And what the world is currently witnessing is tantamount to a third world war. As a result, countries will turn increasingly inward in terms of manufacturing and food security, with advanced technologies to gain the upper hand as the major organizing force in our daily activities. Some economic sectors will decimate, while others will emerge. This will also mean that things like protectionism, nationalism, and similar trends will be on the rise. Next slide, please. So when we look at the impact of COVID-19 on business, we will know that some things will do well, they'll benefit. That's always the case. There's always a silver lining. Online and e-commerce will benefit, they have. Amazon has done staggering business through this crisis. Online payment systems, companies that provide software and solutions for paying online will prosper. Delivery companies will do well. Sanitization will do well, and certain other sectors. But a lot of our focus has been on those who have suffered greatly. Tourism as an industry has suffered. Hospitality, hotels, retail, the airline industry, the travel industry, oil and gas, with the price of oil going to $0 and below zero, where people were paying to remove the oil. Automotive, entertainment, sporting events, short-term space like Airbnb are suffering. They're on the front lines of the fallout of decimation by this war. Shopping malls, retailers, exhibition centers, sports arenas, restaurants, car parts, and many others have been hit in such a way that may not be recoverable in the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So what have governments around the world done to deal with this significant crisis? Well, certain governments around the world have met this war, as we call it, with interest rate cuts. Some interest rate cuts getting down to or at zero. Deferments of payment obligations, for example, don't pay your rent, pay it later. Mortgage payments deferred in certain countries. And payments, subsidies to their citizens. Canada, for example, is giving money to its citizens, $300, $400 to help with rent and other things. Governments are printing money to counter the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. They want to make sure there's enough money circulating to ensure the money supply is sufficient. Of course, when there's a lot of money circulating, that means that money chases assets and services. And so that can create inflationary pressure, which is another problem that we could see. The current economic expectation is that the pandemic will be a short-term shock. This has certainly been the prevalent view and what's been discussed in the press. So people are expecting that this will be a V-shaped recovery. We go down and then we come up swiftly. Or if not, a slightly elongated U-shaped recovery. Indeed, this morning in the Wall Street Journal, there was a discussion that we have hit bottom and we are starting to recover. However, the reality of when there will be a recovery and what type of economic recovery there will be depends on how this virus behaves, unfortunately. If the rate of reinfections is very high, or the virus mutates at a different method than anticipated, or if the virus affects segments of the population that were relatively immune, for example, people in their 30s or 40s, or children, then the assumptions change completely. And the result can be medically, socially, and economically far more devastating. Of course, it's a race to find a cure. It's a race to find preventive medicine. But in the absence of that, the risk is there. Next slide, thank you. So what about the future? Well, in the UAE, how do we see things shaping up? In the UAE, the trends and impacts that we've discussed will also apply. We are not immune. there has been and will continue to be a significant impact on the economy in the industries that we discussed. There will be a movement from brick and mortar to online with respect to retail and services. Online schooling, as everyone knows who has a child and is working with them daily on their schooling matters. Online shopping, noon.com, Amazon, etc. Online meetings with Zoom and other providers, online advisors, online doctors, etc., etc. Everything online as social distancing takes precedence. And working from home will take on a new prominence, and there will be a permanent downward demand for office and retail space. That's almost undeniable. Next slide, please. And with that, I will hand it over to my partner, Charles, to talk to you about the labor market. Charles?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shahram. By the way, if any of you have questions while we're going through these discussion points, please feel free to send them in. And I think we'll take a break probably after the next segment and field any questions you might have, if that's all right, okay? But I want to talk to you about a couple of the measures that the local government has taken, the federal government as well as the governments of the Emirates. In light of the COVID-19 crisis, the UAE is facing a number of sort of conflicting demands at this point. On the one hand, it wants to keep the economy going. And with personnel costs being a major share of our overheads, there's got to be a way to keep businesses afloat by giving them some relief from the cost pressures that they're suffering. At the same time, if everyone is fired and goes away, bear in mind that there's a very large proportion of our workforce are not UAE nationals, but foreigners. If they go away, if talent is not kept in the country, it's going to make the recovery all that much more difficult once the medical part of the recovery begins. So the UAE wants to keep businesses afloat. It wants to keep, at the same time, personnel here. So it's trying to take a number of measures to give relief to employers, but not just do it chaotically or drastically, so that the businesses will stay afloat and that the personnel who are critical for running those businesses will remain in the country and able to then resume full-time work when the crisis is over. So on this slide, sorry, go to the next slide, please. That's good. This is correct. The one before, sorry, 279. That's it. Thank you. Sorry about that. Here are a number of steps that the Ministry of Human Resources and Immunization has taken. It has allowed, the first set of steps were taken at the end of March, pursuant to resolution number 279 of 2020, during which the UAE Ministry of Human Resources and Immunization recognized something that had been happening in the economy already, that the majority of the workers were working from home. White collar, anyone that didn't have to be, on the job physically doing something, that could work remotely, they were doing it. And for the first time, the UAE authorities recognized that this was a legitimate way of going about the performance of one's employment obligations. It was recognizing a reality that was already there, but it was recognizing it for the first time. There had never been an acceptance of remote working beforehand. Now that enables you to comply with the requirements to maintain social distancing and to keep a safe workplace. It doesn't help you reduce your costs. And to deal with the kind of cost aspects of this, the same resolution gave employers the option to schedule paid leave for employees and also put employees on unpaid leave. Now, paid leave, as you probably know, every employee is entitled to 30 days of paid leave every year. And it's up to the employer to schedule that. Many employers scheduled that now during the COVID-19 crisis. But there's an additional provision in this resolution for unpaid leave. And what's interesting there is it's not just, again, done in a random manner, but there is a form that the ministry has promulgated, and the employer and the employee agree. They sign the form, and it's kept with the employer. The ministry might ask for it, but it's just a way to memorialize the fact that there's been mutual agreement on putting an employee on unpaid leave. And the same applies for a temporary reduction in pay. it's been done in the past in previous economic contractions. What happens is the employer goes to the workforce and says, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we need to reduce our payroll overhead by 30%, and we can do it either by firing 30% of you or by putting everybody on a 30% reduction in compensation. And, you know, many employers will put it to the employees. You decide. And when this happens, the workforce almost always elects a reduction in compensation. Again, the ministry's form requires both the employer and the employee to agree to this. This written addendum is maintained with the employer. The ministry might call upon the employer to file it, you know, as and when necessary. But again, it's a way to make sure the issues are examined, considered by the parties, and that the employee's consent for the reduction in compensation is obtained. There is also a measure of permanent reduction in salary. Now, this always exists, but the ministry is just laying it out here, I think, for the sake of completeness. A permanent reduction in salary requires not just signing a form, but it means the employer and employee have got to go through the ministry's portal and file a new amended labor contract that sets out the reduced compensation. And that would be not for the duration of the crisis, but it would be permanent, as you know, for the duration of the employment relationship. For all of these employees whose benefits are reduced, there's also a virtual labor market that the ministry has set up where you can put the employee's CV experience online. And if there are other employers in the market who are interested in hiring those personnel, they can do so. It's a way to share information. The interesting thing about this resolution is that it applies to employers that are registered with the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization. So it does not apply, for example, in free zones. It does not apply for exempt categories like the public sector, defense, security. It does not apply to domestic servants. It does not apply to agricultural laborers. It applies in the, for employers that are registered with the ministry as employers. If you've got a Untitled Munsha, then it applies to you, but not otherwise. A very, next slide, please. A very different set of considerations, and I don't put much detail here. Just I want to flag the issue for all of you. It applies to the minority of the workforce, which are composed of UAE nationals. Now, again, you don't put UAE nationals against their will on unpaid leave or reduced compensation, nor do you terminate their services. There are very, very, again, the UAE government wishes to encourage the hiring of UAE nationals and protect the jobs that do exist. So there's basically a consultation process out there if you wish to take any of these measures with regard to your UAE national workforce. There's also, I'll move to the next slide, there's also a general obligation put on employers to maintain a safe workplace. And that means things like maintaining social distancing and not putting the normal occupancy in the workplace. You know, in our office, we've been doing this. You go to the office today, Afridi Angell, and you know, I think we're well below 30%, to be honest. We're probably at 20, 25%. But the idea is, again, maintain a level of occupancy that's conducive to social distancing. And of course, when we go to the office, we're wearing masks and gloves, which are required if you leave your residence. There's a testing for fever is required as well. And this is a new requirement. Again, this is all from late March. If you go into Emirates Towers, there's at the reception desk, there are scanners that take your temperature. You may not be aware of them, but they're there. And I understand that if someone goes in with a high fever, they'll be either asked not to enter the building or be suggested to take further medical tests. But you walk into Emirates Towers, I guess every workplace now, and your temperature is taken. If you go into a mall, the same thing. It's not surreptitious there. A guy walks up to you and takes your temperature, or any other public space. And maybe this is going to be part of the landscape going forward. I don't know. Of course, fever is not necessarily a symptom of COVID-19, but it's one of the one of the most common symptoms of people who are symptomatic. Again, the obligation is on the employer to maintain a safe workplace. So if the building where your office is located doesn't do any testing, you should do it yourself. When the employees enter, when the employees leave the workplace. And next slide, please. Other measures that are taken are things I've mentioned before, masks and gloves. There is a movement permit that was required here in Dubai back during most of April. If you wanted to leave your residence, that's no longer a requirement unless you wish to leave your residence during the shutdown hours. But it's not 24 hours anymore. Other Emirates are considering the institution of movement permits. Again, if it is required where you are, make sure you get one. They are important. The fines for moving about without a movement permit can be substantial. And it's important, I think, to bear in mind generally that this is an emirate level thing. There are federal requirements, but also each emirate, I guess the profile of the COVID epidemic is a little bit different from emirate to emirate. And so measures are being taken differently in different emirates. And last of all, not last of all, one more slide. I want to just put up some citations here to some of the rules that are being followed. The UAE is taking a very, for a small country, they're doing an extremely good job of following their own rules and developing a regulatory framework for handling this crisis. There is a National Emergency Crisis Authority that was formed back in 2011, which has been repurposed to deal with this crisis. There's likewise a Dubai Crisis Authority that was formed, I think, in 2004, which is now taking the lead in Dubai on what we're facing. There is a federal law on communicable diseases, and COVID-19 has been added by a cabinet resolution to a schedule for that law. A cabinet resolution promulgated last month gives law enforcement authorities all kinds of power to enforce the COVID-19 health measures. You might have seen Resolution 38 of 2020 of the Attorney General listing the fines that can be imposed if you violate a movement permit or drive around without a license or anything along those lines. I put the cybercrimes law there at the bottom simply because you should be aware that the cybercrimes law, making a defamatory statement in the UAE or invasion of privacy can be a criminal offense. If you put it on social media, that just makes it worse. So be sensitive about that. Be sensitive about local expectations, local mores, and try to don't make it worse by putting things on social media. If you have any snide remarks, keep them to yourself, just to be safe. All right. But that's kind of a very, very brief snapshot of what the UAE is doing. If there are any questions out there, I can take them now.
Hi, Charles. Yes, there are some questions.
All right.
Yeah, just going back to Resolution 279 of 2020.
Right.
One of the questions is a reduction in salary, basically in basic salary or allowances?
That could be structured as the parties choose. It can be only base salary, it can be only allowances, it can be a combination of both. You just fill in what you're reducing on the form, but that's entirely up to the employer and employee to agree. Okay.
Okay. And if any of you have, if you'd like any clarifications on the answers, please go ahead and submit additional questions. The second question is, sorry, there was a further extension to that first question. So basic salary will that affect gratuity?
This is for a temporary reduction in salary. The resolution doesn't say so, but I think there's a couple. I think the answer to that would be no. Let me tell you why. This is supposed to be a temporary reduction in salary for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis. It's not supposed to be. A permanent reduction would, Samara, it would affect the way the gratuity is calculated. But a temporary one, I don't think the authorities are going to apply it so as to penalize the employee in that way. Now, your compensation is reduced, and if you give notice of termination to an employee, you pay the reduced salary during the notice period. But I don't think the authorities intend for the gratuity to be reduced. I think it would be calculated on the level of salary before the reduction took place, just because this is an unusual measure. And for what it's worth, I mentioned before that this doesn't apply in the free zones, but DMCC has adopted its own rules on these kinds of measures in that free zone. And DMCC makes it quite clear that for a DMCC employee, the gratuity is going to be based upon the pre-reduction salary, not the post-reduction salary. So that I think sort of is the way the authorities are going.
Okay. Another question, so also related to reduction in salary. When it comes to reduction in pay, since we are paying employees through WPS, how can the reduction in pay be handled? I have heard in order to reduce pay, a new contract will have to be in writing and filed with the ministry, which makes it difficult. You may have to end the contract and pay gratuity and then rehire the employee. Your thoughts on this, Charles?
Yeah, well, the permanent reduction in pay, you would need to file a new contract and amend your WPS records. That's absolutely true if it's permanent. Now, the regulations don't require that for either unpaid leave or a temporary reduction in pay, but I think you do have to amend the WPS records, and maybe filing that form is going to be required. But yeah, if you do this for a large number of employees, you will have to amend the WPS records, or else you'll have an inconsistency there. But it doesn't mean for unpaid leave or a temporary reduction in pay, it doesn't seem to contemplate that you've got to sign a whole new employment contract. Of course, you could do that, but I don't think it's required just to amend the WPS.
Okay. There was you mentioned that the resolution 279 of 2020 doesn't apply to the free zones. What about DIFC employees?
Yeah, DIFC has got its own regulations on this, and I don't have all the details at my command right now, but I think the general point here is that this resolution does not apply in the free zones. And so if you're looking at employment in the free zones, look at the regulations for that specific free zone. I think most of the free zones have done something, but they're not necessarily following the Ministry of Human Resources model. They might be in a general sense, but the rules in those free zones are the ones that the free zone authorities themselves have promulgated.
Okay. Just one last question that's relevant to the employment section, the labor section. What if an employee went on leave prior to COVID-19 lockdown and is stuck and is unable to come back? Can the employer put this employee on leave without pay till further notice? In this case, in this particular case, it's been over 60 days that this employee has been,
Well, there's obviously, I think there are a number of situations like this. And again, what happened, people were on, in fact, this is the case of one of our people, in fact, they're on leave and are stuck outside of the UAE until they're allowed to return. So what do you do? The one thing you can't do, if the person is on annual leave, number one, they can't make it back when the leave is over because there are no flights. You can't fire them for absenteeism. You don't really have an Article 120 grounds for termination. Everyone knows that it's not their fault. You also probably cannot give them notice of termination while they're on leave, because you're not allowed to give notice of termination while an employee is on leave. I think you could, however, transition them from paid leave to unpaid leave. Best to do it with the employee's consent, best to do it with that signed form and then have the form on file in case it's requested. Whether you could put the employee on a temporary pay reduction, you probably could, again, using the form. But I don't think I think if you went to, if you wanted to move on to termination of services, you would have to do it with the employee's consent. You couldn't just give them notice. You might have to ask them to resign or something along those lines. But yeah, there's some uncharted territory here. there are some things that have not been faced before, and it is a unique situation. And so many employers are facing questions like this that have not been, they're arising for the first time. So I hope the guidance I've given is reliable, but in hearing what I have to say, please do bear in mind that the ministry and the courts will have the final word. Again, they're not going to look kindly upon employers trying to impose savings on employees unilaterally. And they will, again, the objectives overall are to keep companies solvent during this crisis, but also keep the employees here. So try and keep those two objectives in mind when dealing with employment matters like this. And I think then things will eventually, if we get to a medical recovery, we'll also be able to reach an economic recovery. That's the hope, anyway. Okay. I think with that, I want to turn over to Shahram, Samara, and
yes, and then we'll deal with the other questions later.
There'll be more questions after that. Sure. Okay. Very good. Shahram, real estate.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much. Great discussion. Moving on to real estate and how that market looks under COVID-19. Next slide, please. So the COVID-19 pandemic will affect the demand for real estate. There's no doubt about that. Office space and retail space demand will drop. We've already discussed that. Similarly with residential, as expats leave the UAE on repatriation flights, residential demand will also drop depending on the sector. How we cope with the pandemic will determine how long such effects will last. So we believe that policies should be put into place to further attract foreign direct investment, as well as migration into the UAE. So in response to a question as to which industries do we believe that cash infusion should be given by the UAE government, we believe that it should be something that drives demand up, because supply, whether it's in real estate and other sectors, is already quite high, and it's demand that needs to catch up. And so the policies that attract foreign direct investment and migration into the UAE are something that could be long lasting. For example, as an idea, we could offer free rent for 1 year in one of many vacant buildings that are out there to employees of a business that relocates to Dubai. It's an incentive which is highly attractive to a business. And of course, you'd have to find willing developers, government developers or others, that then would benefit from associated services or service charges, etc. And other similar policies should be introduced to assist real estate developers, investors, and tenants to cope through this difficult crisis. Banks should also be encouraged to assist debtors with postponing debt repayments. This is already happening in other countries, and otherwise assist to bridge this time. In turn, the Central Bank of the UAE should support the commercial banks to enable such solutions, as it is currently doing to some extent. So we believe that banks should also play a part in this solution. Next slide, please. From a real estate perspective, what are some of the government programs that are there to assist in this difficult time? A lot of these programs relate to rental deferment. So the government of Dubai had a policy to halt judicial evictions and check dishonor complaints actions for a period. The Dubai International Financial Center, for the months of April, May, and June, said that lease payments would be deferred with discounts on company licensing fees as well. And the Dubai Multi-Commodities Center, DMCC, has said that for the same months, there'll be a suspension of rent for flexi-desk and business center tenants. Furthermore, 2 months waiver of rent, where DMCC is the landlord for businesses impacted by temporary closure, and various other measures. JAFSA has a deferment of rental payments and easy installment payment plans. The government of Sharjah, for example, delay rent payments for businesses affected, especially for commercial tenants, and various others, which we haven't covered, but there are a number of government programs that assist with rental payments. Next slide, please. And then there's the issue of force majeure. This these two slides will go to the question that was asked on force majeure as to can we claim force majeure in such a pandemic to help us as an excuse for not performing? And many are asking this question. Isn't the pandemic a force majeure event? Surely it is, and we should be protected and our obligations suspended while this pandemic is still in effect. It is an act of God, we know that. Surely there must be a protection for us in contracts in this once-in-a-lifetime event. So the answer to that is, if your contract contains a force majeure clause, and this force majeure provision, this clause, includes the words pandemic or epidemic, or otherwise you can read the clause such that it would be included. For example, it says force majeure event is a list, and it doesn't include pandemic or epidemic, then it doesn't protect you. If it does include the word pandemic or epidemic, it does protect you. Or if it says including without limitation a list and similar, then you could interpret that it could include an act of God such as a pandemic or epidemic. So that's the answer when it comes to force majeure clauses. So you should look at your contracts, look at that force majeure provision very carefully. But what if your contract does not have a helpful force majeure provision? Are you out of luck? And the answer is no, not necessarily. UAE law is still there and could help you. Let's have a look at that. Next slide, please. So in the absence of a helpful force majeure provision in a contract, UAE law requires performance to be impossible in a force majeure event. And courts require force majeure to be unforeseeable in a force majeure event. So if you don't have a helpful force majeure clause provision in your contract, then you're forced to look at UAE law. UAE law says force majeure must be impossible and it must be unforeseeable. Both of these are arguable as to whether it's impossible or unforeseeable, of course, based on the facts, but obviously quite hard to satisfy in order to fall under the protection of force majeure. It's generally understood that because of these requirements of impossibility and unforeseeability, it may be difficult to invoke force majeure as a protection under UAE law. So then the question is, what other remedy do I have in such a situation? And the answer is, you could always argue that if the event doesn't qualify as force majeure, then it is an exceptional event. This is Article 249 of the Civil Code. The law requires this to be unforeseeable, again, and that performance of your obligation becomes so onerous for you so as to threaten grave loss. So to summarize, if you cannot argue force majeure based on the law because it is not impossible or unforeseeable, then you could argue that it's an exceptional event. An exceptional event requires that it still be unforeseeable, but that the performance of your obligation becomes so onerous to threaten grave loss. And that's a lower standard than impossibility. Of course, this must be proven factually. So hopefully that's answered some of your questions when it comes to force majeure and when you can claim it. It's certainly not a simple matter because once you get into the facts and how you argue it, it can be complicated. With that, I want to thank you for your time and we can move on to questions.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Shahram. Thank you, Charles. We've got a few questions going back to the first part and back to the labor section as well. There is a general question about, is there any current planning by the UAE to consider post-COVID injection of infrastructure funding to reignite the economy, especially considering that most of the UAE is overbuilt in the residential, hotel, corporate offices, and education sectors? What markets do we think will be targeted for this cash injection to restart the economy? Are there any thoughts? Have you seen anything?
Well, I think it's obvious that the markets that have prospered, the industries that have prospered over the past decade would be the prime candidates The top one, I think, would be tourism. As you know, tourism has a number of corollary benefits. And so there'll be a focus on providing a safe touristic experience to attract those tourists again, and as well as people who go through the airport. I think that will be a significant market which they will focus on. And secondly, I think that investment, foreign direct investment, attracting foreign direct investment will be significant to them. As I said before, it's really about demand. I think the issue that we're facing specifically in Dubai over the past few years, and if we focus on real estate, it's a very clear example, is that there is an oversupply, as the question suggests, of residential, hotel, corporate offices, and education. And so the way to deal with that is to increase demand. And to do that, then you can increase migration in of smart capital and foreign direct investment. And that can have a result in increasing demand, attracting foreign companies to come and set up here by offering them incentives.
And there's also another question about economic measures. Do you know of any measures the UAE government is taking to provide financial assistance, loans, grants, etc., to SMEs, similar to measures taken by the US and Canadian governments?
I'm not aware of specific ones. I think the ones that have been highlighted are the rental assistance programs. They've been sort of first and foremost, where the government and quasi-governmental entities are providing rental deferment. They're also providing reduced fees for company licensing, etc. So I think the administrative cost of doing business through government licensing, etc., there's some assistance there, as well as with rental deferment.
Okay.
I think also, Shahram, there's some programs that make funding available to UAE national-owned businesses, especially SMEs. But again, I do not have a full command of the details of all that. But I've seen many announcements about, availability of support to national-owned businesses.
Okay. I'm just going to go back to one question that's labor related. Recently, the DMCC, I believe, allowed a double license, and where you can operate beyond the free zone. In that case, which law applies? Would it be like 279 of 2020 or the DMCC? How does it work? Would you have?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to depend upon, again, it's not so much the question of the license, but it's a question of where the employer is registered as employer. And again, Resolution 279 will apply to an employer that is registered with the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization. And if you have an employer card, Batakat al-Munsha, then that resolution would apply to you. If not, if you're only registered in the DMCC and your employees are all there, then you'll be subject to the DMCC's measures. And the DMCC has indeed adopted measures on what employers can do in light of the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay. If there are any other questions, please send them in. We have another 5 minutes. I think we're pretty much at the end of the questions, but any other questions, please do send them in.
Samar, there's a question on the 30-day handover process by Laura.
Okay.
And the question is, how does the 30-day handover process take place at this time? Law firms, didn't incorporate the force majeure provision into the contract. Generally, sale and purchase agreements, what we're talking about is that someone buys an apartment or an office and there's a sale and purchase agreement and it has to be handed over. Now, those sale and purchase agreements generally do contain force majeure provisions. Perhaps some don't. It depends on, obviously, the lawyer. But generally they do. And then you have to look at the force majeure clause to see whether it includes the word epidemic or pandemic, or it can be interpreted to include it, just like we discussed. And if not, then you fall back on UAE law. Force majeure under the civil code, which is impossibility and unforeseeability. If not that, then you fall back on exceptional event, which is unforeseeability and this onerous, grave loss. So that's the analysis that would have to happen with respect to the 30-day handover process. But generally, it would be understood that such a process would be delayed by such a significant event. And so for sure, there will be some type of legal solution there.
Well, we seem to be okay now in terms of questions. So I'll hand it back over to you, Diana.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, there are quite a few questions. Actually, there is one more question. If you look in the chat, there was actually one question you might want to check there in the beginning of the chat from Deanne Fletcher. And just to tell you, yes, the recording will be shared with everyone. And so no problem. We'll be putting this up on the YouTube channel once we've edited a couple of the bloopers, maybe the phone calls in between. So did you happen to see, Senator, did you see that question already there?
Sorry, yeah, there are a few questions that I just spotted, yes.
Okay. I don't know if you want to touch on any of those quickly. And we were just wondering too, this would be an ideal moment to ask if it would be possible to share your email information or share an email, because I'm sure a lot of people would like to get a hold of you, maybe go more in depth on what's happening. And I'm hoping that in the near future, because I'm sure there'll be some other changes just along the way in the next few months for sure. So it would be ideal to have you back as a follow-up. If I'm obviously being very polite and asking you back. So
really delighted.
Without putting you in a little corner, as they would say in Italian. So yeah, no, it's actually very relieving to hear all the things that they are doing. The fact that there are so many expats and people that are maybe have been in other parts of the world that can't seem to get back in. The new normal, as they say. Did you want to see if any of the other questions, or you think we're good?
No, I think we're good. We've received a few comments back saying that they would like to receive the recording. And Omar sent a comment saying, this is brilliant. Thank you for such a meeting. Thank you all for joining. Yes.
Thank you so very much. You have no idea well, you probably do, all the participants, how lucky you are to have such professionals that are really giving back at this time. So we thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts, because it just shows how human we all are, and we're out there to help the other through these difficult times. That's the same thing what CBC is doing right now. This is our giving back. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we're there for you. So I want to thank you very much. So there's all these things popping up, all these notifications of thank you. So you're getting so many thank yous there, Charles and Shahram. And thank you so much, Samara and everyone. So they've really enjoyed this session. So we'll see you very soon. You take good care of yourselves, stay safe, and wear your masks, wear your gloves if you need to, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.